So, I'd say it's a pretty well known fact that most countries didn't allow women to vote in elections for a very long time. It's only within the last 20 years or so, at the time of making this video, that almost every country with elections allows women to participate in them. The UK is no exception to this trend, with perhaps one of the most famous emancipation movements in the world being active here, the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU for short, better known as the Suffragettes. Over the course of 15 or so years, the WSP was on the forefront of activism in the UK in the name of emancipation. Though I'd say that, if I asked you to picture a suffragette, you'd probably think of something like this: women in corsets and large hats handing out posters and giving speeches. Relatively passive and peaceful, right? Something that men of the time would scoff at when walking past and not much more. Now, what if I told you that the WSPU and suffrage campaign caused over £70 million worth of damage through bombings, arson attacks, letter bombs, and even attempts at assassination? They were so effective in their activities that the boringly named Special Branch, the Metropolitan Police's counter-terrorist unit at the time, had to employ brand new methods for countering the attacks. Techniques involved the use of double agents, and even creating a special bomb disposal unit hidden away on Duck Island in St James's Park, specially formed to try and counter the numerous attacks that the WSPU were carrying out at the time. In 1913, there was, on average, 21 bombing and arson incidents a month. A far cry from the depictions of confused and uncivilized women that the media at the time would willingly depict them as. Now, before we get started on the real meat and potatoes of the video, I just want to clarify something quickly. This video will most likely be one of a two-part set, with this video focused on the group as a whole, so details regarding the individual members will be pretty thin on the ground. I've got plans to make videos for the three Pankhurst sisters, Adela, Sylvia and Christabel, as they're all wildly interesting in their own right, but the majority of this video will be leaving out those finer details. Think of this as a video on the collective efforts of the suffragettes in the UK, rather than the video on the individual actions and people, though the second part of this series will give a brief biography about some of the more interesting women and men that got their hands dirty in the fight for the vote. But anyway, let's talk about the WSPU. Our journey begins way back in the year of 1903 with Emmeline Pankhurst, who we'll talk more about in a moment, due to a lack of progress made by the slightly older and more conservative organisation of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, or NUWSS for short, founded in 1897 as a conglomeration of multiple local and regional suffrage societies. The NWSS had always stuck to relatively moderate speeches under the leadership of Militant Fawcett, which, in Emmeline's eyes, had failed to make any real progress beyond the empty promises given by politicians at the time. The solution to the slow goings of speeches was the founding of the WSPU, a women's-only organisation with the now famous slogan of deeds not words, which thousands of members, including Emmeline and her three daughters, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, would go on to embody, even if they didn't all agree on the extent that the militancy was required. It was in 1905 that the WSPU went from being a group of slightly more direct action, when compared to the NUWSS, to an organisation of truly militant action. This was spurred on by a meeting between John Bamford Slack, a Liberal Party MP who was encouraged by the WSPU to introduce the Women's Enfranchisement Bill. This bill was filibustered to failure by Henry Labouchere, a massive anti-feminist and all-around pretty despicable guy even for 1905 standards. So much so that Queen Victoria, in a letter to Henry Ponsonby, stated that she would never allow such horrid men to enter the government. Though this was more from the fact that she felt he'd insulted the royal family in the magazine Truth, which he was editor of. This failure in enfranchisement through democratic and indirect means was the final nail in the coffin in the eyes of the WSPU's senior council. Made up of Emmeline and her daughter Christabel, Flora Drummond, Annie Kenny and Charlotte Despard. But I'll give some details about the individuals later. The WSPU's council, which itself still operated on democratic principles, had decided that enough was enough. Women were going to be given the right to vote no matter the cost. To copy the WSPU and use a popular quote originating from an earlier 1830 campaign for total political, electoral and economic reform brought on by then Prime Minister Earl Grey, yes, he's where the name of the tea comes from, the council had decided that it was going to be the bill, the whole bill, and nothing but the bill. Quite expectedly, there was internal changes to the WSPU along with their change in doctrine. Christabel Pankhurst, who was one of the strongest proponents for direct action, also insisted that the WSPU focused on the nation's middle-class women, rather than the poorer and less educated members of society, against the wishes of Annie Kenney and Sylvia Pankhurst, who took a more socialist approach to feminism. This culminated in the announcement that Emmeline and Christabel would run the organisation as near autocratic leaders, replacing the committee with one hand-picked by the mother and daughter combo. No doubt choosing members that agreed with the idea that the sword is mightier than the pen. Emmeline thought this move was fully justified, and would go on to say that the WSPU is not hampered by a complexity of rules. We have no constitution and bylaws, nothing to be amended or tinkered with or quarrelled over at annual meetings. This was a move that, as you'd probably expect, angered quite a few individuals, such as Teresa Billington Greig and Charlotte Despard, who believed that this unconstitutional move away from a pseudo-democratic organisation to one that was effectively run by two people was enough to justify the formation of their own splinter organisation in 1907, the Women's Freedom League. Though regardless of their split, the WSPU is now totally under the control of Emmeline and Christabel. This will be important later. To coincide with this newly more militant outlook, a secret group of suffragettes was formed within the WSPU, known as the Young Hot Bloods. Membership of this group was relatively strict. All members had to be unmarried, under the age of 30, had to pledge not to share the meaning behind the YHB acronym, and undertake what was referred to as danger duty. Tasks that were considered especially dangerous, such as the burning of MPs' houses or the bombing of public, albeit unoccupied, trains, though actions like this were relatively uncommon until a few years later. Out of the entire WSPU, Emmeline Pankhurst was the only non-young hot blood allowed to attend their meetings. With many choosing to remain in the WSPU, the more direct activities started off relatively harmless, with protests and mass demonstrations in places such as Trafalgar Square, and a little later in 1908, so-called Parliament rushes. These, as you'd probably guess from the name, would involve tens of thousands of suffragettes gathering outside the Houses of Parliament, before attempting to break through police barricades and the windows of the building to swarm MPs as they assembled. 1908 was the same year that the WSPU adopted the now famous purple, white and green flag, an idea thought up by Emmeline Pethwick Lawrence, which would come to adorn the badges, posters and sashes that its members were often seen wearing and carrying. While their militant activities had certainly increased, the majority of them revolved around sporadic rebellions such as the breaking of windows, confrontations with police officers, and the direct hounding of politicians, and the aforementioned rushes into Parliament. One of the more surprising attacks came in 1909, when Mary Lay, Charlotte Marsh and Patricia Woodlock climbed onto a roof in protest of their exclusion from a meeting, where Prime Minister Asquith was giving a speech, and proceeded to throw roof tiles at the police in the Prime Minister's car. While this is still pretty aggressive, attacks like this were fairly uncommon. This rapidly changed in 1910 with the first Conciliation Bill. There were 3 conciliation bills in total, in 1910, 1911 and 1912, that all failed. The 1910 bill is the one we're most interested in. After a Liberal victory in the 1910 election, which had promised to grant further rights to women, the first conciliation bill was drafted by a conciliation committee for women's suffrage, formed from multiple MPs from varying parties who all supported some form of enfranchisement. This council was the brainchild of Henry Brailsford, a member of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, and was intended to act as a broadly appealing start to the reforms, aiming to give just over 1 million women the right to vote. A limited number of married and propertied women, that is, a woman who owns some form of property, would be given the same voting rights as men, which in turn meant that most of the women this bill would affect were wealthy upper-class women. While these negotiations were underway, the WSPU and other groups, such as the aforementioned NUWSS, halted protests until the outcome of the bill had been decided. However, despite its large support by a number of Liberal, Conservative and Labour MPs, then Prime Minister Asquith refused to give the bill time in front of government, even advising the King to dissolve Parliament before the bill was to be read. He'd essentially shot the bill down, regardless of how popular it was. Immediately after this perceived betrayal from the British government, roughly 300 suffragettes attempted to breach police lines outside of Parliament, in turn breaking the truce that had been established. While on most other occasions, the police would somewhat politely arrest the suffragettes and quickly whisk them away, this time was different. Under orders by then Home Secretary Winston Churchill to try and avoid making arrests, suffragettes were instead violently assaulted, some of which was sexual, by both on-duty officers and public onlookers. In the end, after a 6-hour ordeal, 119 suffragettes, 115 women and 4 men, had been arrested, with more than 130 reporting suffering some kind of manhandling or assault. which included being punched in the face, having their arms twisted and thrown to the ground, and being kicked. This event would come to be known as Black Friday, and would only act to massively exacerbate the tensions between the WSPU and the government. On a more light-hearted note, this incident also led to a surge in popularity of jiu-jitsu among suffragettes, which came to be known as suffragitsu, taught by Edith Garrett as a means of self-defense against violent police, but more on that later. As you'd probably expect, the WSPU were furious, and from this point onward, militant activity would increase massively in both frequency and intensity, though this process would begin slowly at first. Beginning to stray away from the irregular use of violence to the commitment to violence, they had effectively declared war on the British government. There wasn't an immediate outpour of extreme bombings and arson from this declaration. Rather, the actions began to ramp up slowly. From the sporadic attacks and window smashing that they were employing beforehand, to the near daily attacks of arson they became known for. The first of these major arson attempts was in 1912, when Helen Craggs was found in the garden of leading anti-suffragist Lewis Harcourt's home. While fairly suspicious to begin with, she was found with what can only be described as a real kit. Bottles containing nearly 3 pounds or 1.3 kilograms of burnable oil, 2 boxes of matches, 4 tapers, presumably referring to the type of long candle, 12 firelighters, an electric torch, 9 lockpicks, a glass cutter, and 13 keys. If carrying a small arsenal of fire-starting equipment wasn't enough, she was found in the gardens at 1 AM in the pitch black. To top it all off, she was also carrying a note simply addressed to Sir, stating she had contributed to peaceful methods of protest, but had realised that all these actions were futile, deciding that a more radical approach was needed. Though this action wasn't sanctioned by the WSPU, with both Emmeline and Christabel claiming to have had no knowledge of her plans, they didn't exactly criticise her for it. This attempt at arson had a fairly significant impact on public opinion. It had shown that the militant actions in favour of suffrage were no longer going to be limited to attacks on governmental buildings and offices. Private property was now on the table for the targeted destruction. This new wave of attacks came with a massive surge in arrests, with the majority of the WSPU's members going on hunger strikes in prison. These would oftentimes result in a very quick release. Dora Marsden and Emily Davidson were once released after only 60 hours imprisonment. With the media amazed at how quickly they were back out of prison despite their crimes, the Home Office decided the time had come. The first forced feeding of a suffragette took place in September of 1909. While arrests and hunger strikes had been taking place since the beginning of the organisation's activities, the increased number of serious attacks resulted in more and more information regarding their treatment in prison getting to the public. With force feedings now being authorised, the descriptions of them which were getting out are, needless to say, pretty horrible. Alice Paul, an American suffragette in England, wrote in 1909 how she was held down by 3 wardresses, while 2 doctors proceeded to force a tube into her nostril. After grabbing the tube twice with her teeth as it had entered her mouth from her nose, her mouth was forced open to prevent her from biting the tube. Because of how invasive and aggressive this process was, it would oftentimes cause aspiration pneumonia, with liquid food entering the lungs. While the force feeding itself was almost never fatal, the number of suffragettes that suffered long-term health conditions either brought on or worsened by this treatment was huge. Bear in mind that most suffragettes weren't force-fed once or twice, normally tens or hundreds of times. Kitty Marion, who was a famous actor as well as a suffragette, was force-fed 232 times over a 14-week period. That's just over an average of twice a day. You have to have an incredibly strong will to subject yourself to that level of treatment more than 200 times, when the alternative is to just eat some food. With the public's response to this treatment putting the government in hot water, Parliament introduced and implemented the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act in 1913, more commonly referred to as the Cat and Mouse Act. The basic idea behind this legislation was to move any criticism that the government may receive for the failing health of suffragettes and hunger strikes away from their leadership. The bill enabled the government to temporarily release any prisoner whose health was poor, wait a predetermined period of time for them to recover, before rearresting them to continue their sentence. This worked out in the government's favour, as any health effects the suffragettes may have faced from their self-inflicted starvation would be their own responsibility. To put it simply, if they died outside of prison, it wasn't really the government's problem. The suffragettes had done it to themselves. This didn't entirely work out in the government's favour, however. As you'd probably expect with the technology of 1913, keeping track of prisoners you've released can be pretty difficult if they have an entire organisation helping to keep them hidden away and away from your grasp. The bill further reduced the view of the government in the public's eyes, with the cat and mouse name coming from the way that cats will often play with mice before finally killing them. While you might have guessed that there would be some changes in the WSPU with the start of World War I in 1914, you probably wouldn't expect the changes that did occur. The Pankhurst power duo and their non-democratic council declared that the WSPU would cease all activity against the government and instead devote the organisation's woman power to the war effort, both in recruitment of men as well as industrial mobilisation of women. As a result, the WSPU signed yet another truce with the British government, which resulted in the release of all WSPU prisoners being held. But the whole family didn't support this motion. Both Sylvia and Adela, who was now living in Australia, denounced the WSPU's newfound support for the government as both were committed pacifists. One example of this support was the White Feather campaign, which involved handing out and sometimes forcefully giving white feathers to any man who wasn't in uniform, as a form of shaming them for not supporting the war. This campaign wasn't exactly great for the happiness of men who were unable to enlist. The campaign made no distinction between men who chose not to serve and men who were unable to serve. So effective was this shaming ritual that there were multiple cases of suicide caused directly by the public humiliation that the campaign caused. After receiving a white feather, Robert Greaves took his own life, despite the fact he was classed as being unfit for service due to a physical disability. Even soldiers on leave, veterans who had been wounded and those who had completed their service and suffered from PTSD as a result, weren't safe from the zealotry of the shaming. And of course, it doesn't stop there. Lying about their age so they could serve was a relatively common practice for teenage boys at the time, and the white feathers only made things worse. Handing a 16 or 17-year-old boy a feather and shaming him for not being manly enough to serve is probably going to influence them into service, and there's cases where it did. Even when the campaign had a small revival during the Second World War, this lesson hadn't been learnt. In 1942, a 17-year-old boy who was sent home from service after lying about his age received 2 white feathers and shot himself due to this supposed gift from an anonymous person. This, to no surprise, caused yet more splits in the organisation, as suddenly doing a 180-degree turn and buddying up the government was generally seen as a bad move. 2 more splinter groups emerged: the Suffragettes of the Women's Social and Political Union, the SWSPU, and the Independent Women's Social and Political Union, the IWSPU. Now, I respect the commitment to the original cause, but would it kill you to come up with some more unique names? Next you're going to be telling me there's the WSPU TIFT WFALT WSPU. That's the Women's Social and Political Union that's independent from the Women's Freedom League and the Women's Social and Political Union. But I digress. As if more organisation names were needed, in 1917 the WSPU was formally dissolved and rebranded into the Women's Party, with the pretty pro-war slogan of Victory, National Security and Progress. The party had been formed under the guise that to achieve women's suffrage, the war would have to be won first before internal reforms could begin. Though earlier in the war, Christabel had made it pretty clear what she thought about the conflict, making speeches on the German peril alongside members of the British Empire Union, which had changed its name from the Anti-German Union, as well as the National Party. The National Party was a mostly fringe right-wing party founded by Henry Page Croft, and while much of their manifesto revolved around Germanophobia, the eradication of German influence and preservation of the British Empire, they also seemed to support fair wages and collaboration between employers and employees, even attempting to ally themselves with the Labour Party at one point. And after all this, in 1918, after years of violence, arson, bombings and arrests, the Representation of the People Act was passed. This bill gave the right to vote to an additional 5.2 million men for a total of almost 13 million. It also gave the right to vote to 8.5 million women, a far cry from the roughly 1 million women that would have gotten the vote from the Conciliation Bill in 1910. There were, of course, some conditions that needed to be met to have this newfound power. The bill had extended the right to vote for all men over the age of 21, regardless of property ownership or other conditions. Put simply, be 21 years old and you can vote. For women, the bill required that women be over the age of 30 and occupied a residence, be it their own or someone else's, over the price of a yearly £5 value, around £250 in today's money based on inflation, or $350. While this sounds like no money at all, the idea of any living space in England today costing less than £250 for a year is unheard of. But in 1918, according to Richard Holmes' book Tommy, the British Soldier on the Western Front, 1914 to 1918, a nice house in the home counties would set you back around £550, though over 75% of the population at the time still rented their accommodation. This act tripled the number of voters in elections, from 7.7 million up to 21.4 million. A lot of debate took place over the conditions of property ownership, as if no restriction had been applied and all women over the age of 21 were given the right to vote in the same way that men had, then women would outnumber male voters, as a huge number of men had gone to fight in the war and would never return. The government decided that this would be a bit of a step too far, so decided on the conditions outlined. Though interestingly enough, this bill also prevented those exempt from military service on the grounds of conscientious objection from voting for 5 years. That same year in 1918, the Parliament Qualification of Women Act allowed for any woman over the age of 21 to be eligible for election as an MP. And with that, the original WSPU, along with its offshoots and its purpose, slowly faded out of existence. Their mission had been accomplished. While not every woman was given the right to vote, the ability for them to stand in election and gain the votes of millions of fellow women, the direct action they'd built themselves on, became less and less necessary. 10 years later, in 1928, every woman over the age of 21 was granted the right to vote, regardless of property ownership, granting them equal voting rights as men. From the WSPU's founding in 1903, it had only taken 25 years and a world war to get them the right to vote. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you really did enjoy it, then consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel for more of this kind of thing. If there's any groups or people you'd like to see a video on, then let me know in the comments, and other than that, see ya!